Good evening, and thank you for lending us your ears tonight. It's time for Mimi and Pico TV.
Pokem?
Okay, let's jump into this. Imagine, well, you probably don't have to imagine it, a world just saturated with sound.
Right.
A constant hum, notifications, noise, just demands on your attention all the time.
Everywhere.
But now, picture a totally different capability. Imagine being able to listen so deeply, so finely tuned, that you perceive meaning not just in the sounds themselves, but in the pauses, the quiet bits, the actual spaces between sounds.
Like hearing silence?
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
What if some people could actually, in a sense, hear silence? We're diving into material that explores this really fascinating idea. It partly came from a foreign researcher who noticed this, unique listening culture, specifically in Japan.
Yeah, it's an idea that immediately makes you think about our own lives, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a world where noise feels inescapable.
Totally.
And where silence can sometimes even feel, awkward,
Right.
uncomfortable. And this research, the sources we've been looking at, they suggest a really stark contrast. It makes you ask the question, in our noisy, information-packed lives, have we maybe lost that fundamental ability for deep listening?
Have we forgotten how to hear the subtle stuff, the unspoken things, the sounds without sound that these sources talk about?
Exactly. And the person guiding us through this whole fascinating idea is a really key figure in acoustic ecology,
Yeah.
Schafer.
Right, Schafer, the pioneer behind the whole concept of the soundscape.
The soundscape.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically thinking about our environment, not just visually, but, with our ears.
Hearing everything, the city, nature, machines, not just as separate noises, but as a whole composition, a landscape of sound.
Precisely. Schafer really pushed us to become aware of this auditory world, to really experience it.
But okay, while Schafer mapped out this huge soundscape, the material you've got makes it super clear that one thing really grabbed his attention more than anything else.
And that was silence.
Silence.
Yeah.
But not just like the absence of noise. Silence is something active, something meaningful.
That's it. And the sources say it was in Japan that he found a culture where this deep engagement with silence seemed to uniquely persist.
So this deep dive is really about getting Schafer's take on silence. What did he think it was? Why did he see it as so vital? And why was Japan so important to his thinking on this?
Exactly. We're going to explore those surprising examples from Japanese culture that really lit this up for him. We'll look at how he viewed the human ear itself.
Okay.
Grapple with that crisis of noise he talked about, connect it all to some pretty cool neuroscience about language and the brain.
Ooh, interesting.
And then finally think about what reclaiming this ability, what called ear education, might actually mean for us today.
It sounds like a journey into, the simple act of listening, but maybe in a really profound way. And maybe it challenges how we think about intelligence in a world that's just so loud.
It really does. So let's start with Schafer's core idea about silence. He had this really provocative line in his big book, The Soundscape. He wrote, "Silence is the ultimate conclusion of the soundscape."
Ultimate conclusion. That's striking phrasing. It doesn't sound like just stopping. It sounds like something you arrive at after you've really taken in the whole soundscape.
Precisely. For Schafer, silence wasn't emptiness. It wasn't boredom or just, no decibels. It was something that emerged from the soundscape itself.
How so?
Something you perceived after the sounds had fully resonated, maybe faded away. The sources describe it as appearing ahead or beyond the sounds, a place you get to through listening, not by just shutting everything out.
And it wasn't passive for him, right? The sources say he saw silence as vital, almost energizing.
Yes, absolutely vital. A source of something, a space that could awaken your inner self, like a reservoir of potential.
That's a huge difference from how we often treat it.
And that led Schafer to see this really significant difference between cultures. In Western society, he noticed, silence often makes people uncomfortable.
Oh.
It feels awkward in conversation, right? Like a failure of communication, something you need to fill up immediately,
Yeah.
almost negative space.
You totally feel that pressure, that little bit of anxiety if there's a long pause in a meeting or even just chatting with a friend, like something's wrong.
Exactly. But Schafer found this powerful contrast, particularly in Eastern cultures. And the sources really focus on Japan here.
Okay.
There, silence isn't necessarily avoided or seen as empty. It's often valued, treated as meaningful, even, revered. It has its own presence, its own weight.
He must have been fascinated by why. What was it about Japanese culture that gave silence that kind of significance? What were they hearing or feeling in those quiet moments?
And this is where those specific cultural examples from the sources are so helpful. They really show how this valuing of silence, this listening to the spaces between sounds, what Schafer called the blank spaces, is just woven into Japanese life and art.
Like in traditional performing arts, no or kabuki. The sources mention ma.
Ma, right. It often gets translated just as interval or space, but that doesn't quite capture it. In performance, and really in a lot of Japanese aesthetics, it's about those intentional, charged pauses, the stillness, the breaks between lines or movements, the silence after a note.
And the idea is that unspoken stuff, emotions, intentions, deeper meanings, gets conveyed in those pauses.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that. The audience isn't just waiting for the next sound or action. They're expected to actively listen to the quietness, to feel something coming from that stillness.
So the silence isn't passive at all. It's like a canvas for things you can't say out loud.
It's a form of communication that really relies on the listener being sensitive, being able to interpret what's not explicit. The silence is filled not with noise, but with potential meaning, just waiting to be perceived.
Wow. Another beautiful example the sources give is the wind chime, the furin. You hear that delicate sound.
And then it fades.
And the key, the sources say, isn't just enjoying the sound itself.
No, it's about listening to the aftermath, that quiet moment after the sound stops. In that silence, you're supposed to feel the presence of the wind that made it ring.
So you're listening for the sign of the wind, its energy, felt in that quiet ripple left behind, not just the noise it made. That's a real shift in focus.
It cultivates this attention to really subtle sensory stuff, to the causes hinted at by these fleeting effects. It's not just the sound event, it's the context, the energy, the absence that you feel.
And the hearth fire, the aurora, is another one mentioned. You hear the crackling.
Which is comforting, sure.
But the sources talk about listening to that crackling, and in the pauses between the pops, feeling unspoken words or shared history, maybe just the quiet breath of the people around the fire.
Yeah, the silence isn't just empty space around the fire sound. It's a space where the atmosphere, the shared feeling, the history of that moment can resonate more deeply. The sounds kind of frame the silence, make it stand out.
Schafer found special value in these blank spaces where sound is born. Sources keep saying that, like it's a core theme. He apparently noted he just couldn't find that same level of cultural attention to silence, that value placed on pauses, in the Western cities he knew.
Which brings it back to you, listening now. How often do we really consciously listen to the silence between sounds? Not seeking total quiet, but noticing that brief pause after a car passes, or the space between sentences on a call, or the quiet between bird calls.
It's a totally different way of listening.
It is.
It makes you realize how much information, maybe connection, we might miss by only focusing on the loud bits, the explicit sounds. Which brings us to Schafer's broader view of the listener. He wasn't just cataloging sounds, was he?
No, that's a really crucial point in the sources. Schafer's work was fundamentally human-centered. He wasn't just interested in the physics of sound or the environment. He was deeply concerned with the human being who hears it and how they hear it.
He saw the ear as more than just like a microphone passively picking up data.
Way more. For Schafer, the ear was an intellectual sensory window, a primary powerful way we build our relationship with the world. A vital channel for understanding, for connection, for engaging with reality. It's not just input, it's interaction, interpretation.
And that perspective feels incredibly relevant now, maybe even urgent. The sources use that striking Japanese phrase, right, a world that's too audible, overwhelmingly noisy.
And just think about it. The sources list examples we all live with every day. The constant low hum of electronics, the endless pings from our phones, the background noise from TVs, radios, smart speakers, street ads, basically yelling at you.
They're jumping into our ears without invitation, as the sources put it.
Exactly. They're inescapable, demanding attention, constantly filling up the auditory space. Your ears are working overtime, processing all this input, even when you're not consciously trying to listen.
Yeah, you feel that exhaustion sometimes.
And the sources suggest this is precisely why Schafer's whole aesthetics of silence might be becoming relevant again because of this extreme noise. When sound is everywhere, relentless, often unwanted, the ability to find, perceive, and value silence and the meaning within it becomes, well, not just a cultural quirk, but maybe a crucial skill.
For what? Like mental balance?
For maintaining cognitive balance, yeah, and connection.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, you value clean air most when the pollution is thick.
Right. When noise is pollution, silence becomes necessary.
Yes. And the sources highlight that Japanese culture, even with modernization, seemed to hold on to this inherent valuing of listening. Not just listening to music, but listening to nature, feeling meaning in pauses, respecting the spirit of silence. This deep power of listening is what Schafer saw as the essence, the ability to perceive that blank space where sound is born that felt so strong in Japan.
And this power of listening, this ability to hear the blank spaces, the sources suggest it might be a form of human intelligence, maybe one that AI, which is great at processing data, struggles with.
Well, it's about interpretation, context, empathy. Perceived through the ear. It definitely forces us to broaden how we think about intelligence, beyond just logic or information.
So while he was fascinated by Japan, Schafer was also really worried about the global trend he was seeing.
No, deeply concerned. His major worry, which he documented for years, was just the sheer increase in noise levels everywhere. He saw the sound environment changing drastically, and he called it acoustic pollution. He wasn't just describing it, he was sounding a clear alarm.
The sources mentioned the context, like London in the 50s, New York in the 60s, lots of excitement about technology.
Faster cars, louder machines, new ways to broadcast sound, huge optimism. But Schafer saw that alongside this excitement came this decline, a loss of sensitivity in the human ear. People were just adapting to the constant noise, getting desensitized.
All those technologies listed: air conditioning humming everywhere, constant traffic noise, ads blaring, and now smartphones and earphones creating these private sound bubbles.
Yeah, all contributing. Sound became less something you chose to listen to, like a concert or talking to someone, and more just this constant state, an unavoidable condition of the environment. And Schafer had a really stark term for where he thought this was heading.
He called it the extinction of silence.
The extinction of silence. The sources use that phrase, and it really conveys how serious he thought this was, like losing something vital, irreplaceable.
It sounds like losing a species or habitat.
And for Schafer, it was a loss on that scale. But not just physical, not just losing quiet places or rising decibels. He saw it as a cultural crisis. Meaning the very idea of silence as something positive, something meaningful, was being forgotten, overwhelmed by the noise.
So it wasn't just him being nostalgic, saying things were better back then.
Not at all. The sources are clear on that. His view wasn't simple nostalgia. He consistently argued, really forcefully, that listening and thinking aren't separate. They're deeply linked, maybe even physiologically. So he saw this erosion of our listening ability, this extinction of silence, as a direct threat to our cognitive abilities, our capacity for deep thought, for reflection, for understanding.
Okay, let's dig into that link between listening and thinking, because the sources bring in some really interesting neuroscience that seems to back up Schafer's intuition.
This is where it gets really fascinating. The sources mention this joint study, Tokyo University and University of London researchers. They look at how the brains of Japanese and English speakers process sound, especially language.
And they found big differences in the brain areas used.
Significant differences, yeah. The study suggested English speakers, when processing language and sound, mostly use the left hemisphere.
Which is typically linked to logic, linear processing, analysis, breaking things down step by step.
Right. Which makes sense for languages often built on explicit subjects, clear grammar, direct statements. The processing focuses on that sequential flow of information.
But they found something different with Japanese speakers.
Very different. They tended to activate much wider areas, engaging both hemispheres simultaneously when processing sound and language.
Both sides at once. Why?
Well, the sources connect it back to those features of Japanese language and culture we talked about. The emphasis on overall relationships, grasping context, the meaning in the ma, the pauses and interpreting implications. The stuff that's not explicitly said but is understood.
Ah, okay. So the brain isn't just tracking the words in order, it's also processing tone, atmosphere, that kooky idea relationships, meaning hidden in what's not said. It's handling the explicit and the implicit together, sound and silence.
Exactly. The sources suggest that this way of communicating, which really relies on the listener interpreting a whole range of cues beyond just the words, fosters a neural processing style that's more holistic, more contextual. It engages the brain more broadly.
And this lines up perfectly with Schafer's idea about listening power shaping thinking power.
It really does. The sources point out this research fits perfectly with Schafer's gut feeling that how we listen fundamentally shapes how we think. If your culture and language train you to listen for nuance, context, meaning in silence, your brain might develop a different, maybe more integrated way of handling auditory information and, well, thinking itself.
He had that incredible quote cited in the sources.
You cannot close your ears. Therefore, what you listen to determines your intelligence.
Wow. That just reframes intelligence completely. It's not just about test scores or logic puzzles.
Right. Schafer's saying a core part of our intelligence comes from how we engage with the auditory world, what we notice, what we value in the soundscape or the silence within it. It implies that cultivating our listening is actually cultivating our minds.
Seen that way, it makes so much more sense why Japan stood out to Schafer in his studies. The sources keep calling it a precious exception to this trend of silence extinction.
Yes, and it wasn't just about finding quiet spots. The sources really stress that this listening aesthetic, valuing silence and subtle sound, was deeply embedded in cultural practices, even in the physical environment, the architecture, the relationship with nature.
Like standing in a quiet temple garden, you hear those subtle sounds rain on moss, a distant bell.
And the point the sources make is, these aren't just random background noises. They reflect this deep Japanese aesthetic that values time spent in silence. That silence allows these specific, often quiet sounds to become noticeable, almost highlighted. The quiet makes the subtle audible.
And the design of old Japanese houses, too. Shoji screens, tatami mats, wood.
The sources point out these materials aren't just about looks or even total soundproofing. They have acoustic properties. Shoji screens soften outside noise but let some filter through subtly. Tatami and wood absorb inside sounds, reducing echo, creating quietness within the space. The architecture itself seems designed to embrace silence.
So it's arranged for listening?
Kind of, yeah. Not just to kill sound, but to shape the space for a certain kind of listening.
So it's not just that Japan had quiet spots or old buildings. It's that the culture inherited and actively kept alive the space, physical and mental, to use the ear differently.
That's the key takeaway from the sources. It's a cultural inheritance, passed down, not just technology. Schafer's idea that silence isn't empty but vital. That resonates deeply with traditional Japanese ideas like Yugen's subtle suggestion, mystery in yohaku, the beauty of blank space in art. It's about finding meaning in the unfilled space.
And the sources argue that in a world getting noisier where maybe other cultures are losing that sensory balance, this quiet listening culture, this ear intelligence, is still subtly being passed down in Japan.
Schafer seemed to feel Japan was holding on to this fundamental human way of using the ear, something eroding elsewhere. It makes him ask, and us too, how are your ears connected to the world?
Let's go deeper into the language itself. The sources call Japanese language a pillar of intelligence in this context.
Yeah, this intersection of language and perception is really key. The sources point out unique things about Japanese, like subjects in sentences often being ambiguous, or how sentence endings can subtly shift meaning, and especially that cultural emphasis on communicating without saying. Oh, wazonishite tutaru.
Communicating without saying. That sounds tricky. How does that work?
Well, the premise, according to the sources, is that communication isn't just about the explicit words. There's this underlying expectation that the listener has the power to listen, not just to the dictionary words, but to the whole context.
Like tone, timing, pauses.
Exactly. Tone, timing, pauses, shared understanding, the whole atmosphere, the kuki of the moment. The listener is actively piecing together the unspoken.
So meaning gets carried in subtle cues, implications, what's not said, and you rely on the listener to get it.
Pretty much. The sources argue that because of this structure and cultural expectation, Japanese functions maybe more as a language for listening and interpreting these subtle cues, rather than just explicit verbal assertion.
And growing up in that kind of environment would naturally sharpen a specific kind of ear sensitivity.
The sources strongly suggest that. It fosters this unconscious habit of listening beyond the surface, listening for intent, finding meaning in silences, becoming really attuned to the nuances of the atmosphere.
It creates a different relationship with silence and conversation, too. Like the sources say, an English speaker might get anxious in a long pause and rush to fill it, whereas a Japanese speaker might more naturally accept that the silence itself can hold meaning, can be part of the communication.
Yeah, they're culturally conditioned, the sources suggest, to see silence not as a lack of communication, but as a valid, often meaningful part of the exchange.
And this fits perfectly with Schafer's view. His respect for cultures that fostered this ear intelligence seems tied to his idea of silence having vitality. It's not empty, it can hold deep meaning. And the Japanese language itself seems built to include silence, fostering this kind of intellectual maturity based on sensitivity.
It suggests the language use itself shapes the listener's cognitive and emotional landscape.
And this idea of listening as a way of life shaping intelligence shows up in other cultural practices too.
Absolutely. The sources bring up the tea ceremony. Very few words are spoken during the ritual itself.
The focus is on the sounds, right? Water pouring, the whisk.
Exactly. The sound of water heating being poured, the whisk against the matcha powder, the sound of a fan opening. These specific quiet sounds happen in this intentional quietness. The sources call them a form of silent hospitality. The host communicates care through the precision and sound of their actions.
Or haiku and tanka poetry, those super short forms, 5-7-5 syllables.
Right, or 57577 for tanka. That strict limit forces economy with words. And the sources explain that the Japanese ear finds real enjoyment and meaning not just in the words, but crucially, in the spaces between them.
You're listening for the unspoken thoughts, the emotions, the world hinted at but not contained in those few syllables. The silence around the words is part of it.
Exactly. The structure of the poetry, like the language, cultivates sensitivity to suggestion, implication. It demands the listener actively participate in creating meaning from the gaps, from what's unsaid.
So listening isn't just a skill. The sources argue it shapes the very structure of the Japanese heart and mind. Omaro no kuzu. It's fundamental.
That's the deep insight Schafer reached through studying sound. He saw the significance given to listening, perceiving meaning in silence, meant Japan retained this capacity to philosophize using the ear, engaging deeply with the world through hearing in a way less common elsewhere.
And that famous line, silence is the ultimate conclusion of the soundscape, maybe makes the most sense grounded in that Japanese experience he observed, where silence wasn't an end, but a rich space.
That's what the sources suggest. And they make the point, this wasn't taught like, okay, time for listening class. This deep listening culture wasn't created by formal instruction. It was passed down quietly, unconsciously, in daily conversation, gestures, and that empathy found and expressed in shared silence.
That encounter must have really changed Schafer himself. What did he take away personally?
The sources quote him reflecting later in life, saying something really powerful. I went to Japan and learned how much I hadn't been listening.
Wow. So it wasn't just about finding a quiet place?
No, it was realizing his own Western ears, even as an expert, were maybe missing this whole layer of human experience, human intelligence, the kind gained through this deep listening, engaging with silence. The sources say it fundamentally changed his perspective.
So his soundscape idea became more than just a technical way to analyze environments.
Much more. It became about consciousness, presence, connection. How do we choose to engage with the world through our ears? The sources also mention older Japanese practices that seem to actively train this ear education.
Like the Terakoya schools, where kids learned by reading aloud.
Yeah. Learning wasn't just silent reading. It was physical, auditory. Knowledge embedded via voice and ear, speaking the words, hearing yourself and others. Carving knowledge into the body and mind through sound.
In traditional arts, you didn't just read a manual.
No way. The sources point out learning meant close, long listening to the master. Their words, sounds, presence, their whole being. Learning deeply rooted in ear and body, through attentive absorption, not just explicit explanation. The sources see these as anticipating Schafer's idea of conscious ear education.
But back to the present, we face this modern challenge, this too-audible society.
Exactly. Notifications, traffic announcements, ads, constant assault. Our ears are always processing something. The sources really hammer this point. The experience of true deep silence, or even just consciously noticing subtle sound in silence, is extremely rare now in many places.
And Schafer warned about this dulling of our senses, this extinction of silence.
He did. And he saw cultures like Japan as holding on to that original power of the human ear, that capacity for subtle engagement being lost elsewhere.
But why was it so resilient there? What made it possible?
The sources suggest a key reason is that deep philosophy of living in harmony with nature, and how that shaped ear sensitivity over centuries.
Like those examples again, wind chime, hearth fire, rain, snow.
Yes. The sources repeat, these aren't just random background sounds. They're culturally meaningful confirmations of connection to nature. Listen to with a different attention, not just the sound, but what it signifies. The nature perceived through the sound and the silence around it.
These things grew over centuries, shaping the Japanese ear and heart.
And the sources suggest Schafer felt Japan wasn't just preserving old ways. By valuing listening and silence, they were naturally carrying forward values crucial for humanity's future. a different kind of intelligence gained via the ear, a philosophy not easily copied.
So this philosophy of the ear, it's not just history, it might be key for navigating today's world.
The sources make a strong case. We're drowning in information, words, images, notifications flooding our senses. This overload, they suggest, is shaving away the space we need for deep thought, for reflection.
It's hard to think deeply or connect when your senses are constantly bombarded.
Exactly. And that's why Schafer's rediscovery, this understanding of listening power hearing, not just sound, but the space before sound, the meaning within silence, is becoming so valuable. It's the philosophy of the ear, fostered by the culture he saw in Japan.
Let's revisit those examples one last time with that deeper understanding.
Okay. It's not just hearing the wind chime. It's listening for the blank space the wind passes through, feeling the unseen force. It's not just the cozy sound of the hearth fire. It's feeling the depth of the shared silence it creates, the history in the pauses. And it's not just hearing words. It's cultivating the ability to embrace and interpret the unspoken silence shared alongside them.
And the sources suggest, maybe culturally, linguistically, Japanese people are uniquely positioned for this sensitive listening, having inherited this ear intelligence.
And back to Schafer's quote, "Silence is the ultimate conclusion of the soundscape." The sources reinforce. This silence is not empty. It holds deeper emotion, richer memory, more nuance, a profounder sense of presence than words often can.
Which leads right back to a challenge for you, listening now. In your own life, are you valuing silence, making space for it?
Think about those modern habits the sources mention. TV always on, earphones constantly in, feeling you have to fill every conversational gap. These things actively dull our ear sensitivity, our capacity for this deeper listening.
But the sources offer hope, right? Simple steps to reclaim this sensitivity. Schafer's ear education.
Yes, it's about consciously choosing to listen differently. Small things. Step outside, listen intently for just 1 minute. Just listen. On your commute, instead of grabbing your phone, just close your eyes for a moment. Feel the presence of your surroundings through your ears. Subtle atmosphere, distant sounds, quiet hums.
In conversation, try listening not just to the words, but what's not said. The pauses, the tone, the silence.
Exactly. Ways to cultivate that sensitivity that, as the sources say, cultures like Japan practice naturally with everyday sounds, wind chimes, streams, snow, tatami. Those sounds, and the silence framing them, shaped a certain sensitivity.
And the sources conclude this part by stressing the value of this sensitivity today. A culture or individuals who can soothe without loud words, connect through deep listening. It's presented as a kind of human intelligence AI can't replicate.
So as we wrap this up, let's go back to Schafer's big realization in Japan. It wasn't just the unique sounds that amazed him.
No, it was the combination, right? The Japanese ear listening and the cultural blank space, the value placed on silence that received those sounds and found meaning in the unsaid. That's what struck him as so precious.
And the sources leave us with this really powerful, almost poetic final thought. A quiet challenge. If you listen closely, you can surely still hear it. The sound of the wind, the voice of silence, and your own inner sound.
It's like a call to pay attention, a suggestion that this ear intelligence, these subtle sounds, these vital silences, they haven't disappeared. They're just waiting for us to rediscover them, maybe hidden under all the noise.
Schafer's final call to action, realizing the importance of this, echoes from the sources. To build the future, we must first reclaim our ears.
A profound thought to take away. In a world drowning in noise and data, the sources suggest maybe truth, meaning, connection. They're hiding quietly right beside you now, just waiting for you to truly listen.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
See you next time on Mimi and Pico TV.